Question number 2. Dear Dr. Chloe, I've struggled with anxiety. Okay, I feel like these questions are all from me from the past.
Jamie, did you secretly write these
I wrote
questions?
all of these questions. Dear Dr. Chloe, my podcast really needs some numbers. Okay. I've struggled with anxiety for a long time and I'm finally ready to see a therapist. How do I make sure to find a good one?
Yeah, that is such a good question because as a clinical psychologist, I hate to say this, but I really think a lot of therapists can even do more harm than good. And some of them can have even a financial investment in just trying to make a person come all the time, every week, forever, as opposed to even giving them 6 or 8 sessions of skills building. And then the person goes off on their own and they're totally fine. And instead of looking at that as a success, the therapist sometimes is like saying, oh, gee, there goes my income. And I know this because I actually employ other therapists as well as train other therapists in how to build a successful practice. So I've heard behind the scenes, some of them actually open up and share this fear that if they help people too well or too quickly, that they won't have as many clients. And so
Oh,
I'm always trying to explain to them, no, you'll actually have more clients because people will start referring everyone to you if you get good results.
right.
But a lot of therapists just can't, for whatever reason, seem to understand that. So I'm very glad that this person is asking for help. So a few tips. First of all, make sure the person is licensed. I know this sounds like really simple, but a lot of people, especially online now, they're just hanging out shingles and, maybe they're life coaches or whatever. No disrespect to life coaches. Those are great. But if a person is actually dealing with clinical anxiety, then you probably want somebody with clinical training.
Not
And
just
so
someone who makes a good Instagram reel.
exactly. They're very charismatic people and they're inspiring and they're great, but they're not necessarily super skilled in, treating anxiety. So one thing you would want to do is you would Google the person's first and last name along with the word license, and your state to see what pops up as far as them and their license. And if nothing comes up, then you would even say to them, hey, I heard from a psychologist somewhere that you should always verify a therapist's license. Could you tell me where I could verify your license? And if the person gives anything like that feels like a dodgy answer or an evasive answer, or tries to turn the tables on you, like, why is the license so important or
Oh,
whatever, then, you would definitely want to run away as fast as you can. Also, I think it's perfectly valid to ask the person, have you worked with somebody with my types of issues before?
mm.
And how long does it typically take for the person to start feeling better and, maybe not even need to be coming to therapy anymore? And once again, you're going to be looking for an open, supportive answer, which I will tell you, you shouldn't necessarily expect to find. I will say it's actually harder to find an excellent therapist than it is to find a mediocre / lackluster therapist. So if you ask that question, you want somebody who gives you an answer that makes sense, like, well, probably 3 or 4 months, and then maybe you come back once a month for maintenance mode. If the person says, well, every situation is different, I couldn't possibly give you any, meaningful answer. And then they even turn the tables and say, well, why are you in such a hurry? Do you have an issue in your life with speed or whatever? They're almost making you feel uncomfortable for asking these basic questions again. I would definitely keep looking. And speaking of keeping looking, I would encourage a person, especially if you've never been in therapy before, to visit like at least 3 therapists before you choose one. Because for a lot of people, just the experience of going to a therapist and talking to someone in and of itself feels really good. And so they go to the therapist and they have a good experience. And then they think, well, I'll just keep going to that person. And they don't realize that there might actually be other therapists that have other approaches that could even potentially be helpful. And psychology studies have shown that for high functioning people, high functioning meaning, people that are not constantly in a psychiatric hospital or constantly incarcerated and who are able to keep basic employment and keep a roof over their head. That's what psychology looks at as markers of high functioning people, believe it or not. And so for high functioning people, psychology studies show that the personal fit between you and the therapist is actually more predictive of therapeutic success even more so than the type of therapy that the person is using. So
Mm.
it's very important that you feel comfortable with the person. And if they're making you feel judged or like they you just don't feel like you're connecting with them, definitely keep looking.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that because I feel like that last person knew my ex and you knew my old therapist. Because, you know, there are a lot of bad therapists out there and they're finding people like us in vulnerable situations. And a lot of them aren't even maliciously bad, but I feel like your listeners, if you go to a bad therapist and you feel like this isn't working, you might actually feel like you're more crazy. Because that happened to me where I was like, man, I don't think I want to be here anymore. And now therapy is so trendy. I'm glad it is. More people are openly talking about it, I should say. That people are like, you got to just go to therapy. You got to just go to therapy. Every podcast is sponsored by BetterHelp. Just go to therapy. Use promo code Tim Dillon, whatever. And so if you go and your internal guiding system is saying, I don't like this, I don't feel good, there's part of you that's probably thinking, man, I'm even more broken than I thought. Even therapy's not working for me. And it may just be a crappy therapist.
Right. You could be internalizing it as if it's something about you, as opposed to either A, it's a crappy therapist, or B, it's even a fine therapist, but just not the right fit for you.
Right. Right. Yeah. Because I mean, I think we all also have friends, some of our friends who are the loudest about telling you to go to therapy. They go to like 3 different therapists and you're like, but you're a mess. I don't want to be
Yeah.
like that.
One other thing too that I think is very important for people who are shopping for a therapist is a lot of therapists, I think that they take on too many clients because maybe they're overworked and maybe they're
Mm.
not paid enough or whatever, but therapist burnout is a really big issue. And believe it or not, I've had people come to me and I say, why are you leaving your previous therapist? And they're like, well, because the person literally fell asleep in session. I've heard that seriously, like half a dozen different people have told me that. Also, they'll say things like, well, because the person would maybe give me homework, but then they would forget about it. And
Oh,
so
that
would
happened to me all the
I.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. And so when you're interviewing the therapist, I think it's important to say to the therapist, will you be giving me homework? Because not all issues lend themselves to homework. And it's okay if like they're not giving you homework and they can explain why. But in general, I think there should be like some kind of homework between sessions. So I would ask, will you be giving me homework? And if yes, will you follow up with me on that homework at the beginning of the session? Or is that my job to do? And again, I'd be looking for a therapist that says, I will follow up with you,
Yeah.
because part of the issue that the patient often has is issues of avoidance or forgetting or whatever. And so just like when I show up to my personal trainer, I don't want them to be like, I don't know, what should we do today? I want them to be like, Chloe, I know how much weight you lifted last week, and here's how much you're going to lift this week. And if the therapist turns it back on you and says, do you have issues with trying to make people be responsible for things in your life or whatever, then I would again keep looking. I would look for a therapist that takes ownership of their role.
Yeah, I mean, having your trainer forget about abs is bad enough, but showing up and your therapist not caring after you spent an entire week like going through your mom trauma and journaling about it and then being like, what do I do with this? And I think that's why I was attracted to your book and the podcast is because, and I've had therapists make me feel bad for this, is because I am high functioning. I want to fix stuff. I don't just need someone to shout my problems to like a buddy at a bar and then I leave and then I go and I'm like, oh, I get to vent to my therapist. I'm like, yo, I want to fix this. I want to get
Mhm.
better as a person. And a lot of therapists will kind of make you feel like you're doing therapy wrong if you want to fix your problems.
I know, I totally agree. And I don't know if that's because maybe the therapist is lower functioning themselves, or like I said, maybe they're just overworked or whatever. But I would just ask at the beginning, like, will you follow up with me on homework? And I would be looking for somebody whose eyes bright up and they say, oh, yes. And then they say, like, you can tell that they're glad that they have a live wire as a client. That's a good
Yes.
relationship.
I love that. I love I'm going to refer to myself as a live wire client from now on.